The question, which comes first, motion or cognition? Sounds simple, but it hides several different problems. Sometimes people mean, do we feel something before we interpret it? Sometimes they mean, do bodily reactions create emotion, or does emotion create bodily reactions? And sometimes they mean, are emotions irrational forces that interfere with thinking, or are they part of how thinking works? William James is useful here because he refuses the simplest versions of the debate. He does not treat emotion and cognition as two separate compartments. He treats them as intertwined functions within a single stream of experience. A good place to start is James's most famous contribution to emotion theory, the James-Lange view. On this account, emotion is not primarily an inner mental event that then produces bodily expression. Rather, the order is reversed. A stimulus elicits bodily changes: posture, breathing, heart rate, muscular readiness. The felt emotion is largely our perception of those changes. In the classic formulation, we do not tremble because we are afraid. We are afraid because we tremble. Whether one accepts this as a complete theory or not, the key Jamesian point is that emotion is not an isolated feeling in the head. It is deeply tied to embodied patterns in the organism. This already complicates the usual emotion versus cognition framing. If emotion is partly the perception of bodily change, then it is not simply thought versus feeling. It is perception, in a broad sense, of what the body is doing. And perception for James is never a passive reception of data. It is selective, context-bound, and shaped by attention and habit. So even when James emphasizes the body, he does not remove the mind. He is shifting the emphasis toward the organism as a whole, where feeling, perception, and action readiness are continuous. Now consider cognition, broadly understood as interpretation, judgment, and conceptual organization. James does not deny that interpretation matters. In his psychology, consciousness is a stream that selects. Attention is the spotlight that determines what becomes salient. Habits are the channels through which thought and action flow with minimal friction. These ideas imply that what we call cognition is constantly shaping what gets noticed and what gets amplified. But James would also insist that the stream is never purely cognitive. It is saturated with bodily tones, interests, aversions, and urgencies, features that are not add-ons, but part of how experience is structured. A helpful Jamesian way to put it is that emotion and cognition are not separate things that later interact. They are different aspects of one ongoing process. Experience arrives with a certain interest, a certain felt direction, and attention then selects within that field. When you interpret a situation, you do so under conditions already shaped by bodily readiness and affective tone. And when you have an emotion, you do not have it in a vacuum. It is bound up with what you take the situation to be, what you expect next, and what you are prepared to do. This is why James is skeptical of purely intellectual accounts of emotion that treat feelings as the results of cold appraisal alone. But he is also skeptical of purely irrational accounts that treat emotion as a blind force that simply interrupts reason. For James, emotions are functional. They organize readiness. They highlight what matters. They recruit attention towards certain cues and away from others. In that sense, emotion is not the enemy of cognition. It is part of the system that makes cognition purposeful rather than random. To see the interaction more clearly, consider fear. A purely cognitive story might say fear is produced by the thought, "I am in danger." A purely bodily story might say fear is produced by physiology alone. James's view resists both extremes. The body responds to cues, often quickly, and the feeling of fear is inseparable from those bodily changes. But what counts as a cue, and what gets selected as relevant, depends on attention, memory, and habit. Two people can walk into the same situation and have different fear responses because the stream of consciousness selects differently based on past associations and present focus. Cognition shapes selection, but emotion shapes urgency, and salience. This also helps clarify what James might say about the order question. Do feelings come before thoughts? Sometimes bodily change and felt urgency come first, and interpretation follows. But interpretation can also shape what bodily patterns get recruited. James's point is not to declare one universal order. It is to show that the emotion-cognition distinction is not a simple sequence. It is a feedback loop within a single stream where bodily feeling, perception, attention, and interpretation continually influence each other. If we compare James to later frameworks briefly, we can see how he anticipates modern debates without being identical to any of them. Later theories emphasize appraisal, interpretation, and cognitive labeling. Others emphasize physiology, affective systems, and embodied processing. James gives you a vocabulary for keeping both sides present. He forces you to recognize the body's role in feeling, while also recognizing consciousness as selective and interpretive. That combination is one reason his account remains teachable. It prevents a simplistic either-or. James's broader philosophy also matters here. His pragmatism treats ideas as instruments that must show their consequences, applied to emotion and cognition. This means the useful question is not merely which is more fundamental, but what each framework allows us to explain. A bodily-centered view may explain the immediacy and force of emotion. An attention and habit view may explain why emotions cluster, repeat, and become predictable patterns. A cognitive interpretation view may explain how meaning reshapes feeling over time. James pushes you to treat these not as rival slogans, but as complementary, explanatory tools. So, what is the Jamesian conclusion? Emotion and cognition are distinguishable, but not separable. Emotion is not merely a thought, and cognition is not merely a feeling. Yet both are functions inside the same moving stream, a living process of selection, readiness, interpretation, and action. If you study them as isolated parts, you will miss their real structure. And if you treat one as the master of the other, you will miss how experience actually works. James remains valuable because he teaches you to read the mind as an organized, flow-embodied, selective, and purposeful where feeling and thinking are different faces of a single system.